Hello, children. This is Grandma Carla with Chapter 9 of Freddy and the Perilous Adventure. And here we go. Chapter 9. Mr. Bean, whose nap had been cut short by the laughter of the cows, came out of the kitchen door just as Mr. Gulcher started across the barnyard. Freddy saw the two meet and stand for a moment talking, and then Mr. Gulcher handed Mr. Bean a cigar. And Mr. Bean smelt of it and put it in his pocket, and they went around and sat down on the front porch. Freddy hadn't heard anything that they said, and ordinarily he was too polite to listen to conversation that was not intended for him. But he felt that this occasion was too important to let politeness interfere. So he went around to the other side of the house and crawled up through the shrubbery until he was close enough to listen. And in my opinion, Mr. Gulcher was saying, unless the police catch him, he won't ever be heard of again. Mr. Bean puffed on his pipe. Don't know why anybody would steal a balloon, he said. You ain't ever had one, have you? Asked Mr. Gulcher. Mr. Bean shook his head. Well, that's it. Take it from Gulcher. Gulcher knows. Balloons are queer. You get attached to them after a while, like some folks get attached to horses or dogs. Now, the way I figure it, this pig, he gets attached to this balloon and he can't bring himself to give it up. Gulcher, he says, who's Gulcher? He can't ever catch me. Here I am up in a balloon and I can go sailing on the rest of my life. He don't know that the gas will give out after a while and he'll come down and won't be able to go up into it again because he don't know how to get more gas. Being a pig, he don't realize these things. He ain't dumb, said Mr. Bean shortly. I know he ain't, said Mr. Gulcher. Not for a pig, but after all, he is only a pig. I say, he ain't dumb, repeated Mr. Bean firmly. Well, suppose he does realize all those things, said Mr. Gulcher. I don't want to say more than I can prove, but he did steal the balloon. He ain't a thief, said Mr. Bean. Mr. Gulcher didn't say anything for a minute. Mr. Bean puffed on his pipe and looked out placidly over the fields. Well, said Mr. Gulcher firmly, so he ain't dumb and he ain't a thief, but where's my balloon? When Mr. Bean didn't know the answer to that question, he kept still. He kept still now. Some people would have said they thought maybe it was this or maybe it was that, but not Mr. Bean. For he knew that lots of people never learn, that no answer is better than a wrong one, and sometimes than the right one too. Well, said Mr. Gulcher, you ain't much help, and that's a fact. Waiting for your proposition, said Mr. Bean. My proposition? You come here to see me. Must have a proposition to make. Well, make it. Mr. Gulcher looked at him sharply. Well, now, he's your pig, he said. And if I was to sue you for the loss of business and the value of the balloon, you'd have to pay, because any damage he causes is your responsibility. Mr. Bean nodded. Never denied it, he said. Oh, well then, said Mr. Gulcher, there's no reason why we can't agree. There's the balloon gone, and there's $500 I was to get for the ascension of the circus tomorrow. 200, said Mr. Bean. Eh? Said Mr. Gulcher. Why, 200 wouldn't hardly cover the cost of. Save your breath, interrupted Mr. Bean. 200 was what Boom Schmidt agreed on. Phoned him this morning to find out. Oh, well, said Mr. Gulcher, let it go. Gulcher wants to be fair. Gulcher ain't one to quibble over a dollar or two. Say 200 for loss of business and for the balloon. Well, that's kind of hard to figure. That's where balloon, well, sir, that balloon's more than just a balloon to Gulcher. That's a balloon, you say, just a bag full of gas, but not to Gulcher. That balloon and me, we've been together now for 15 years. We pretty near wore out then, said Mr. Bean calmly. Wore out, said Mr. Gulcher. No, it ain't wore out. It's as good as the day it was first blown up. We ain't getting anywhere, said Mr. Bean. He dug down in his pocket. Here's your 200. You count that You lost that on account of my pig, and I'll pay it." "But the balloon." "I don't buy any balloons," said Mr. Bean. "Suppose your balloon comes back down tomorrow. Then I have a balloon on my hands, and what do I do with it?" "Do with it? I guess, Mr. Bean," said Mr. Gulcher solemnly, "if you'd had any experience with balloons, you wouldn't ask that question." "Shouldn't have asked it anyway," said Mr. Bean, and he got up and held out the $200. Mr. Gulcher counted it slowly. "But this only makes up for the ascension I couldn't make," he said. "It don't pay for the balloon." "Pig'll bring it back, likely," said Mr. Bean. "If not, meet me in a week's time at Judge Whipple's in Cinnerboro. We'll let the judge decide what I owe you." And he said good day and went into the house. After Mr. Gulcher had gone, Freddy went back to the cow barn. He was pretty pleased to find that Mr. Bean really believed in him, even though appearances were so much against him. He realized that in spite of his gruffness and apparent indifference, the farmer was a real friend, much more of a friend than some of the animals who were always protesting their friendship. "I'll get that balloon back if it's the last thing I ever do," he said firmly. But even if he got the balloon back, Mr. Bean was still out $200, and how could he do anything about that? It was true, he had about $7 in the First Animal Bank, of which he was president, but it had taken him 2 years to get that together. "If it takes 2 years to get $7, he said to Mrs. Wiggins, "how long would it take to get 200? 700 years, said Mrs. Wiggins. Freddy didn't think that was right, and he tried to do it in his head. But the cows were trying to do it in their heads, too, and they kept saying, 7 goes into 20, put down 4, carry 3, that's 35 plus 8, and things like that, until it's no wonder that he got a different answer every time. But as the lowest answer he got was 37 years, he decided that there was no use in going on with it. But the cows went right on. Mrs. Wogus said she made it 98, and Mrs. Wurzburger thought it was only 17, but Mrs. Wiggins stuck to 700. It's only common sense, she said. If you get $7 in 2 years, then in 700 you get 200. It sounds right when you say it, said Freddy, but I'm sure there's a mistake somewhere. But anyway, if it only takes 17 years, it's too long. So I'll have to think of something else. He sat down against the wall and tipped the silk hat over his eyes, and the cows looked at one another, and Mrs. Wiggins winked and said, "Come on, girls. If there's going to be some thinking done, it's no place for us." And they tiptoed quietly out. And sure enough, in about 5 minutes, Freddy really did think of something. It is true that in another minute he would have been sound asleep, but that is often the time, just at the edge of sleep, when people do think of the best things. The trouble is that they are seldom strong-minded enough to jump up and put their ideas into action at once, and so they drop off to sleep and the ideas are lost. Freddy wasn't specially strong-minded, and perhaps he would have gone to sleep anyway, but just as he got the idea, his head nodded and his hat fell off, and that woke him. He jumped up and started to dash out of the door just as Jinx, who had heard that Freddy was hiding in the cow barn, started to dash in. And they met in the doorway, and Freddy's hat was knocked off again. As they started to pick themselves up, they both said crossly, "Hey, why don't you look where—" And then they stopped and said, "Oh, it's you." "Sorry, old pig," said Jinx, and he picked up the hat and brushed it off and handed it to his friend. "Boy, that's a stylish outfit. Looks like you were invited to the White House for lunch. Where'd you steal it?" "I didn't steal it," said Freddy coldly. "I borrowed it." "Like you borrowed that balloon, I bet," said the cat. "Golly, you certainly got yourself in a real mess this time." "I didn't steal the balloon either," said Freddy, and there's no time to explain how. "Listen, I've got to get out of here without being seen, and I want your help." "Thought you wanted me to meet you tonight," said the cat. "Sanford said—" "That's off now," said Freddy. "Got a better plan. Go get those mice over here. Tell them to bring their parachutes, and then you get Mr. Bean out of the way until I get started. He's in the stable, and he mustn't see me." "Okay," said Jinx. "But where are you off to?" "It's an adventure," said Freddy. "Tell you afterwards." "Why don't I go with you then?" Oh, I don't know. It's kind of dangerous. I guess I can handle it better alone. Freddie very much wanted Jinx to go with him, but he knew that the surest way to get him was to pretend that he didn't. That's a cat all over. Let him think you don't want him to do something, and he's crazy to do it. Oh, come on, Freddie, you wouldn't leave me out, would you? Your old pal that stood at your side on 100 battlefields, Jinx, the old tried and true, whom you know you can count on for the last whisker and toenail. Back to back, and bare teeth and claws, and bring on your lions and tigers. Eh, Freddie? That's the old bean spirit. That's the, oh, all right, said Freddie. Anything so I don't have to listen to a pep talk. Yo! Jinx yelled delightedly and dashed out of the barn. A few minutes later, the four mice, Eek and Quick and Eenie and Cousin Augustus, came running in. They dropped their parachutes, which they had been carrying in their mouths, and all began talking at once. What's up, Freddie? What goes on? You going to give a show? How'd you boys like to take a real parachute jump from a balloon a mile high? A real jump? Oh boy, what a chance. You bet. From a real big balloon? Would we like it? Would we? And suddenly they were very quiet. How far up did you say? Said Quick in a voice which was small even for a mouse. Well, maybe not a mile, said Freddie, but good and high. My gracious, you don't mean to say you're scared. No, said Eenie, no, not scared exactly, only, well, our aunt, you know, she lives over in Cinnaborough, and she maybe wouldn't approve. She's got funny ideas, you know, Freddie, said Eek. She doesn't like us to do things that are, well, sort of, you know, showing off. Not dignified things, said Cousin Augustus. Listen, said Freddie, you haven't heard from your aunt in 5 years, and anyway, if I remember right, she used to do slack wire walking when she was younger, and if that isn't showing off, but of course, if you want to turn down a fine opportunity to win fame and fortune, it's nothing to me. Ducks go up in balloons, pigs go up in balloons, but mice, no, they're too scared. What'll Mr. Bean say? But oh, forget it, boys. I'll go get some rabbits. The mice looked at one another. Rabbits, said Quick, and then he jerked his head. They all picked up their parachutes. When do we start, Freddie? That's the spirit, said the pig. Get in my pockets. I'll tell you more as we go along. He looked cautiously out of the barn door, and then he heard Jinx crying for some time, and now he saw that the cat was standing by his empty saucer on the back porch and looking up hopefully at the kitchen door. Every now and then he would give a very piteous meow. Pretty soon Mrs. Bean came out and looked out. I know what you're up to, you villain, she said, but you've had your dinner, and there isn't any more for you. Give him something to eat, Mrs. B, came Mr. Bean's voice from the stable. He's had his dinner, said Mrs. Bean, and if I let him coax me into giving him more, he'll be teasing me all afternoon. And she smiled at Jinx and went back into the house. Meow, said Jinx. Meow, meow. Oh, good land, exclaimed Mr. Bean, coming out of the stable. Stop that bellerin'. I'd rather feed you 10 meals a day than to have to listen to that. Said Jinx. Mr. Bean bent down and scratched his ears and then picked up the saucer and went into the house. And as soon as he had disappeared, Freddie jammed the silk hat down on his head and bolted out through the barnyard. He crossed the meadow and was safe behind the fence below the pasture when Mr. Bean came out again. Then, when Mr. Bean had put down the saucer of food before Jinx and had gone back into the stable, he went on up towards the woods. At the edge of the woods, he waited for Jinx. He had to wait a long time, but at last Jinx came. You might have hurried a little, he said. Chicken gravy, said the cat, licking his lips reflectively. I will say this for Mr. Bean. He's no hand to pet his animals, but when he feeds them, he feeds them. They went on up through the woods. It was pretty hot, and Freddy had to sit down several times and cool off. The mice in his pockets kept wriggling around and pulling themselves up and trying to see out, and every time they wriggled, Freddy wriggled too, for they tickled. And at last he said, "You boys come out of there and get up on the brim of my hat. It's bad enough being tickled all the time, but when you're hot and sticky, it's awful." And so they did. They came to the rim of the valley and started down across the fields towards the wood and towards the road. And they were almost reached it when up the road they heard a brrr, and they saw two dots that got bigger and bigger. "Get down in the grass, Jinx," said Freddy sharply, and he lifted his arms and he held them out stiffly and stood motionless. The two troopers came buzzing along on their motorcycles, but when they saw Freddy, they stopped. "Funny thing," said Bill, "but that looks like the Scarecrow over at Bean's." "Funny to see, too, with such grand clothes," said Wes. "Folks must have been pretty dressy around here in the old days." Bill started to walk over for a closer look, but there was a big ditch with water in it between him and the field, and he stopped. "You know," said Wes, "to me, a plug hat is like a red flag to a bull. When I was a kid, bet you a quarter I can knock it off first," said Bill, picking up a rock. "Your first shot," said Wes, but just as Bill raised his arm, he dropped it again and said, "Hey," in a startled voice, for Eek and Quick and Eenie and Cousin Augustus had jumped off the brim of the hat into the grass. "Looks like mice," said Wes. "What do you suppose?" "Let's go over and see," said Bill. Freddy knew that something had to be done, and done quickly, so all at once he dropped his arms. "Don't you come over here," he shouted. "Don't you come near this place." "Doggone," said Bill, "it's alive." "Who are you and what are you doing there?" demanded Wes in his most official voice. "I'm out here making my living, that's what I'm doing," said Freddy angrily. "And what business is it of the police to throw rocks at me? I should like to know. Going about my lawful business I am, and it's your duty to protect me, not throw things at me. Wait till I report this to your commanding officer, my lads, and see what he says." The troopers glanced at each other. After all, throwing stones, even at a scarecrow, wasn't part of their duty, and if they were throwing them at a man and the matter was reported to the lieutenant, well, it wouldn't be any help towards their promotion. "We're sorry," said Bill. "We thought you were a scarecrow." "A scarecrow!" yelled Freddy. "Me? A scarecrow? By George, young man, I'll see you punished for that kind of insulting talk if I have to carry the matter to Albany. Fine guardians of the peace you are, calling names, throwing rocks." "Excuse me, mister," said Wes. "We really didn't mean anything against you, but you were standing there with your arms apart and not moving." "Course I'm not moving," said the pig. "How can I catch 'em if I move?" "Catch what?" said Bill. "Mice. I'm a professional catcher and trainer of mice. Put crumbs on my hat, come out and stand still. Mice get on the hat for crumbs. I scoop them into my pocket, take them home and train them." "Anything illegal about that?" "No, no," said Bill soothingly. "It's a new occupation to me, but as far as I can see, no harm in it if you like it." "And I hope," said Wes, "that you'll reconsider about reporting us. A report like that—" "I can tell you one thing, my lad," said Freddy. "You'll be reported if you give me any more of your talk. Get along and we'll say no more about it. But keep this up another minute or two." The balance of his remarks was lost in the roar of the motorcycles as the troopers kicked them into action. "Wow," said Freddy. "Now I have got to sit down and cool off." That is the end of chapter 9. Let's look at our pictures here. This was Freddy as he was peeking around looking at the conversation between Mr. Bean and Mr. Gulcher and finding out that Mr. Bean really did believe that he was an honest pig and would not steal a balloon. And we know that he didn't steal the balloon, that the balloon wouldn't operate properly. And then here's Jinx talking to Freddy after he knocked his hat off. He said, "Sorry, old pig." And then that is the end of chapter 9, and we will start chapter 10 in just a little bit. And this is Grandma Carla, and I love you.